Good evening. The Board of Appeals is now in session. Today is Wednesday, December the 12th, 2018. And I've just called the meeting to order. The first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes. May I have a motion to approve the September 12th, 2018 minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the September 12th meeting.
Thank you.
I second that motion.
Okay, any discussion on the minutes as presented? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Abstained?
One.
Okay, all right, so the motion passes, four ayes, none opposed, and one abstention. Okay, thank you. This evening, we are going to have a work session, and I'm going to turn it over now to Caroline Seiden, who will present the session.
So thank you all for being here. We haven't had a full board in a while, so I'm glad it worked out for everybody and that we had time to do it. Frank was nice enough to put together a PowerPoint presentation for us, and before I even get to that,
Sure.
I'll give him a moment to settle in, but we do finally have an alternate after a long time without one, so I'm very happy about that. And this is Mr. Neil Wang, who is here also this is his first meeting. So we are glad that we're all together, and we thought it was a good time to just go over things that we haven't really talked about in, I think it's maybe 4 or 5 years since the last time we did something like this. So, you know, it's just us. It's hopefully casual, and I'll let Frank go through his PowerPoint. But if anybody has questions along the way, I'm sure he will. You're free to jump in.
It's actually easier for me to stand up. I, about 10 years ago, riding a bike, managed to break my back. And that's not a problem, but when you're doing other work, you just change everything you do with that. And in doing some work in the yard, I think I may have slightly created a little bit of a lower disc problem. So sitting for me, it's getting a little better. It's been about a month. But it actually would be easier just to be able to stand up, because standing and working doesn't create a problem. It's the sitting part that sometimes gets to be uncomfortable, and at the end of the day, it can be, certainly let me know. I think it's the office chairs. And sometimes in giving a presentation, when you're a lawyer, you're kind of used to standing up and presenting anyway. So if that works for you all, it works for me. But actually, Caroline, you should feel free to, it's really in some ways for both of us, because I did the first draft, and Caroline actually cleaned it up and made sure that the print was something everybody could read. So thank you. I agree with her. Thank you all for being here, and welcome to our new alternate. Certainly glad to have you as well. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, I guess we want to go to the first slide and welcome and intro, is just to give you an idea of where we're going to go tonight. I don't think it'll be an extended, long presentation, but laying out some basic processes. Here's how we work. For some of you, this may be a bit of a reminder. A little bit of who's who. Caroline is... Oh, you need that? Sorry. I actually didn't realize we were being taped, which was part of the reason why I took it away from there. So anyway, back to where we were started. In terms of who's who, Caroline is one of your main liaisons, and Jasmine Forbes is another person who's, I believe she's presented to the board.
Yes, she has. She has met several times. She just couldn't be here tonight, but she is typically, in my absence, would be the contact person for any of you. And Greg's not on that slide, but he's here as well.
Right, right. And there may be others who present too, depending. Obviously, I'm the assistant city attorney. I'm the person who generally sits there at the nameplate
And then your officers, Carol is chair, and Aaron serves as vice chair. If there's a meeting where Carol can't be there, then Aaron would run the meeting. So what's the board's key purpose? It's really three things: decide variances, special exceptions, and administrative appeals, at least from Chapter 24 of the zoning code decisions. So getting into a little bit more, we'll get into some of these details, staff and officers. What do the planning liaisons do? And essentially that's Caroline. That's maintain the record, arrange meetings, draft staff reports, and resolutions. So a lot of the paperwork that is done, which is really the critical part, in order to have that clear record, is part of what they do. Caroline, I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to add in terms of, sometimes there's day-to-day as well that...
Well, we often will meet with, we'll often have a process where the applicant calls the planning and code administration well ahead of an application, and we will work to make sure that by the time they submit an application, if it's a special exception or a variance, that it's considered complete. I mean, our job as staff liaisons is to be impartial, but also to make sure that the applicants come to you with a good, clean record and a good application. So we will work with them on that. I also, as I'm sure you have all noticed, typically draft a resolution if we think we know where it might be headed. There are times that I have not, because I don't know where it's headed, and we will then do a resolution based on your discussion at the time of the meeting, which is why it's important that we have a record of the meeting itself and how everybody came to the conclusions that they came to in a situation like that. Well, in either case, it's important, but.
Right. And the many times, as we've had with deciding the small cell decision on an apartment building or condo, to go back and forth between one meeting it being postponed, and then we will reconsider it and reset the meeting for a month or two later. There's a lot of staff work involved as well to carry out what, as far as we can tell, you're interested in approving, and what's consistent with the city code and what ends up being a reasonable decision. In a lot of ways, that means that what is presented is something that's palatable, reasonable, and that you can work with, as opposed to having to get into the day-to-day, which is really not what you have a board member doing. You want to decide the policy issues. So our staff is known for working with the applicant to try to present something that is feasible and sensible, and that we can gain a consensus around, and that makes a difference. I've been in places where that's not always the case. There are times when that doesn't happen too, and the applicant does have a right to present. So what does the city attorney's office do? Well, we obviously help with legal questions, sometimes preventing a legal problem. When there are questions, I can respond to the table. I have. Sometimes it's a matter of offering some guidance, helping out with questions that come up behind the scenes on orders as well, because I'm part of the city staff. I'll help out there, and certainly answering questions before the hearing. It's certainly possible if there's a serious legal question where we could. That is one of the reasons that you can do a closed meeting, which we'll talk a little bit about in the future. But for the most part, the advice I'm offering, there's no harm in your hearing it in public. There are simple answers, and in many ways it's actually helpful for the public to hear it too, as well as the applicants and anybody who might be opposed, because there's an understanding then, okay, here's the basis, here's how we're operating. Board officers, we mentioned, include a chair and a vice chair, and there are annual elections, and generally that's January or the first meeting of the year. Sometimes there isn't a meeting in January, but it would be the next one coming after that, and sometimes even that'll get postponed because you do want to make sure you have a full complement of members in order to make a good decision, whether electing, re-electing, or what have you for chair. So getting into those three things that you do, they are distinct and a bit different. First of all, it's variances. Well, a variance is a bit of an exception, but we're going to be talking about special exceptions. So I won't use the word exception, but what I would say is it's allowing a change to an existing requirement. It's a modification of, under the code, the way it's written, of density, bulk dimensional, or area requirements in the zoning law. So where there's a change requested, often it'll be a setback requirement. If they have to be a certain number of feet from the side yard and they're going to be a foot and a half in, it's beyond anything that staff can just waive, that would be brought to you for a judgment. And the standard there sometimes can be additional standards, but generally it's unnecessary hardship or practical difficulty. And some of the other standards that sometimes are discussed or come in, it's not something that they created themselves to create that practical difficulty, that they're certainly not at fault. And if it's clearly something that isn't benefiting them in a special way over anybody else. Again, the idea is to try to treat people fairly, and if they're facing an unnecessary hardship, again, not just hardship, but unnecessary, there's no real point to that, then that can be a very good reason to consider a variance under those standards. What happens when there's a violation? That generally becomes a municipal infraction. Just like any other element of the zoning code, that's kind of what would happen. Now the second type, and I'm assuming the slides are changing as we go, because Caroline's picking up pretty well with what we're doing. The special exception is a little different. That's not just an exception for anything. That generally has to be specifically delineated as a special exception. So it's a grant of a specific use that is specified. This thing can be done, this particular use can be allowed by special exception, meaning it has to come to you. That would not be appropriate generally or without some level of restriction, meaning they want you to weigh in on that. It has to be authorized by the city code, very specifically, has to be in accord with the master plan, your ultimate decision, has to be in harmony with the community character. That's not a cut and dried decision. That's something that you have to look at each community separately, and it may be a matter of part of the community, may be a bit different than some others, and certainly not harm the community in any way. That requires a number of specific conditions that maybe staff will frequently suggest some. You may change those, you may add to those, you may delete those, but the point is they want those specific conditions to be considered, to laid out, to make sure that a particular use that's identified not as a use, shall we say, of right, but as one that's a special exception, that if we are going to allow it, there have to be some certain conditions satisfied. What happens when that is violated? Well, there are a couple of things that can happen. It can be a municipal infraction, but under certain circumstances, there can be an amendment to a granted special exception. That can be, sometimes that may be requested by the applicant, that happens. That can be something recommended by staff as well. But you also have the ability after a public hearing to revoke a special exception. So therefore you have some element of very basic control. That's the power of a special exception. That's why the board becomes very important in considering whether or not to grant a special exception, not only in laying out the conditions, but if it's a violation, yes, we can go through the municipal infraction process, which we also handle, but you can actually remove that special exception, meaning whatever was being done is not allowed anymore. So, I mean, it's a very extreme step to take. I don't know that we've had an instance.
I don't.
I think we may have had a few where we thought about maybe that would be the role to take, but it's certainly there. The last item, the third one, is administrative appeals. That's an appeal from any Chapter 24 decision. That can be a staff decision. That can be a planning director decision. That can be a decision by the planning commission, which I know is happening. It can be the historic district commission. Any of those, if it's dealing with a Chapter 24 issue, so it could be permitting, it could be planning, it could be many different things, can come to you. It has to be on the record. And there must be an error. It could be a legal error, could be an error of fact, but there has to be an error that you would find in that record to say, well, then that should be overturned. Now, of course, any of the decisions you make, even as we're talking here about administrative appeals, can also be appealed, and that appeal would be to the circuit court, and we'll get into that. In terms of the timeline for administrative appeals, generally it's 17 days, and that's laid out in the code that lays in Chapter 24. It's Article 7 that lays out your details. So in dealing with all these three issues, and those are the three main things, and they're all very important, the board is quasi-judicial. It doesn't mean you're a court, but it doesn't mean you're legislative. You're not creating law, you're not creating new policies. You are applying the existing policies, you're applying the facts of each situation to the existing laws as best you can. That's really largely what a judge does as well, and that's known as quasi-judicial. In terms of how you go about that, there is prior notice and an opportunity to be heard. Every decision is based on the record. The record is critical, becomes very important up and down the line. It requires impartiality, no conflicts, no bias, as well as no ex parte communication. And we'll talk about that, but that's mainly related to the fact that every decision you make has to be based on the record. It has to be based on, in some way, some document, comment made that was presented as part of testimony that is all included in the record. And as I had mentioned, appeals are to the circuit court. Those two are on the record, and that's the deadline there is 30 days, whereas yours to come to you is the 30 days, or is the 17, I'm sorry. So the ex parte rule, that can be very confusing in some situations. That is related to the fact that all your decisions are on the record. What that is saying is that discussions or correspondence outside the record or in private, where the other side, if there is another side, let's just say the public, is not invited, are called ex parte. That can be a situation, let's say it can happen very innocently. You're going out to take a look at a property that somebody's asked for a variance or a special exception, and the applicant happens to show up and they want to talk to you. Well, that potentially could be ex parte because you're having a private discussion, not part of the record, not part of anything else. They are prohibited because they aren't part of the record. A decision that is allegedly or potentially based, at least in part, on an ex parte communication could be subject to reversal on appeal. Why? Because the circuit court standard is you've got to show substantial evidence on the record. The burden's really not on the city necessarily to show that, but that's still the standard that the circuit court wants to see. Either will uphold a decision if there's substantial evidence in the record, or will reverse if there's not. And if it's at all based on ex parte communication to say, well, here's what I thought, or here's what we had heard, that was outside the record, that has in some cases led to reversal, or not for the city of Gaithersburg, but in other cases of appeals, of board appeals like this, also could lead to a remand just to say, look, you've got to do a new hearing and consider the actual evidence and make sure that your decision is actually based on whatever your record is. That's the important of it. So if you do have ex parte information that's not part of the record, that's why it can be very important. If you know the person personally, if you've had prior involvement, what happens? Well, that does occur. We're not a large city necessarily. It's sometimes not at all unusual. You may have somebody across the street that you'll be aware of. Certainly with the Historic District Commission, some of the members there, because they care about historic districts, are part of it, and they're not so large that they won't know the people. Well, the issue is, in that case, it's a matter of disclosure, to say, look, I know the person, but in my judgment, it's not going to make any difference. Then it's part of the record that you at least have said it. But it can also happen that it's not necessarily just knowing the neighbor, but there can be some interaction attempted. The best rule, recommend that anybody wanting to talk with you privately, off the record, on a pending board decision, that they present that issue to staff, because staff will be working with the applicant and others to try and pare down the issues, or present it at the hearing, or submit it as part of the written record. If they just want to send a letter in, that can also be considered. Many times that can be very innocent. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's trying to say, oh, we want to talk to you behind the scenes. They may say, look, you're part of the city government, I'm a resident of the city, I think you all represent me in some way. Well, that's true. If I want to talk to you, I should be able to talk to you. And it may not necessarily even be the applicant. It may be somebody across the street, maybe somebody very innocently who's not necessarily presenting a problem, but just to say, look, I know the guy, I know this person, this is not going to be harmful, I think it's a good idea. Again, best step, that's great. We have to decide based on the record, send in a letter, present it, and that's really the best way to go in that situation. Again, it's not so much, I mean, yes, it is important, you don't want to have any question of bias or anything like that, but the main thrust of it is all your decisions have to be based on the record. That's really the main concern of that. It's not, it is important that there not be bias, it is important that there not be the sense of keeping the public out of the decision. Yes, all of those do apply, but that's the main thrust of the ex parte decision. So, now, you do have a set of rules of procedure, which for many cases you don't have to get into the details, but those are here if you do have a highly contested case in some instances. In others, they're just reflecting city law, and there are 11 chapters, some of which some are simply saying, this is what you are, you're the Board of Appeals. Others lay out the details in terms of, like Chapter 2, filing appeals and petitions. You do have the right, there should be pre-hearing statements if you have a serious application. That is what gives staff the opportunity to work with an applicant as opposed to just showing up that night with no preparation at all. Not only would they not necessarily be prepared, staff wouldn't have had the chance to analyze it, to consider the city code, and even somebody opposing wouldn't be aware that much of what it is they're opposing. So if there are expert reports, they're supposed to be presented ahead of time. Again, that's so that you can make a reasonable and a rational decision the night of the hearing, as opposed to having things drag out forever. There are certainly notice requirements, and that's in Chapter 4 of the rules, and that simply recounts what the city code already requires for property owners in nearby neighborhoods. Chapter 5 deals with the hearings and the processes, and especially if there's a contested case or a highly complicated case, it becomes more important. Chapter 6 deals with the decisions. The main thing is they need to be in writing, and generally you have 60 days after a hearing in order to issue the decision, but the way the code's written, it says 60 days unless the board decides it needs more time. So it's kind of usually we're issuing the decisions, or you're issuing the decisions the next day, right after the hearing, or even at that time. In some cases, it can take a bit longer, and then the appeal deadlines would all run from the time of the issuance of that final decision. You can have rehearings, you can have reconsideration. The city code does allow that. There's 10 days for somebody to ask for that, and there are a couple of standards where it just can't be done. It has to be done based on a reason, and that would be if there's some mistake, if there's some new evidence, if there was some sort of an error, or there's some other compelling reason that we just simply have to do this, have to rehear it. That's essentially a standard to avoid having you have to do them all over again all the time, because many people won't take no for an answer if that's the answer. In many other cases, though, it's not going to change the ultimate outcome in terms of appeal rights. It's not cutting anybody off, because their new appeal would go from the time of the rehearing decision. So, and that would be true if somebody was opposing it as well, and let's say there's a change of what happens. We've mentioned officers a few times and communications, and I think I kind of said a whole lot about ex parte that I think we have a good idea there. We've talked a lot about the record. again, the record is critical to what you do. Appeals to and from the board are always based on the record. That record includes anything that I should say is in the record. That can be documents, transcripts, public hearing, it can be video, pictures, diagrams, as well as the board discussion, which there'll be a recording of, if not a transcript of. The appellate records on appeal, that's all there is. There isn't anything else. So remember the ex parte rule. There's nothing outside the record. Some records in a, I don't want to say a prior life, but in a prior job, I dealt with appellate work where sometimes we'd have 4,000 or 5,000 page document that were part of the record that you would look at. And many folks who are lawyers always want to make legal arguments, which is fine. That's what we do. But when you have that many documents in there, sometimes in the cases I would be dealing with is say, you let me look at the hundreds of pages of transcripts there, because when something is said on the record, if it's on the record, it's relevant. And I wouldn't be, many times people get very honest when they're speaking in a transcript or in a deposition that's part of the record, and we may very well have a number of admissions that kick the case out before we even really have to go that far. That happens, and that's often. The point is, when you're on appeal, it's not a matter of what you think. It's not a matter of outside opinion. It's not a matter even of what makes sense. It's all a matter of what is in that record, and that's why it's so important. We've mentioned the circuit court standard, substantial evidence in the record. When there is an appeal from you, actually appeal to you as well, if that's what happens, the burden's on the person appealing, or I should say in somebody presenting, they do have a burden to show that what they want is according to the city code. If you're being appealed from, same thing. Somebody's got to show that there was an error, that there's not substantial evidence to support your decision. But as I had mentioned before, we don't want to assume that the court is going to be on our side, so that's part of the reason why to be so careful in presenting the record. So in terms of the record, I've talked about how it has the facts and all of that. Part of the substantial evidence decision is also to show that there are clear reasons for the decision and that those voting for it knew what they were voting for and were supportive. So the record does need to show reasons for the decision and legal justification. Now, the staff report and the order that the staff have put together generally go through that in a number of different pages. The court is aware of that. What many times a judge will be looking at is, well, what did the board members say in going through it? Was it just motion second and we're done? When that happens, there's not a lot to go on. I mean, we will, in an appeal situation, certainly argue the order and the details and what's there. But what really helps is when there are comments from everybody, and sometimes as staff we know to have, if you have everybody, let's say you have all 5 members there, to say, what do you think here? What do you think to start at one end? In terms of creating a record, there's no better way to do it. That is the best way to do it. Now, that doesn't mean I have a 10-minute exposition as to why. That's not necessarily necessary. Many of the decisions that are brought to you don't require that. We understand that. You know that as well. But at least some acknowledgement to say, well, based on what he said, seems to be a credible statement. This seems to meet the city code. There doesn't sometimes need to be more than that. But where there are questions, a dialogue back and forth makes sense, because then when you do have a motion, when you do have a decision, your record not only shows the staff analysis and how it fits the law, but also makes very clear, no, this vote, let's say it was 4-1, it's very clear those were 4 who voted for it. The record, which will include the hearing and the decision and the discussion, makes it very clear that each one knew what they were doing. This is why they were making their decision, all based on what was going on. Those are the ones, I think, I would say generally the city does a pretty good job across the board of where I've been involved, and when sometimes they don't, I suggest that they do that. So maybe I help a little bit too. But I think your chair here has done that historically, and for the other commissions as well, which is one reason why we don't have that many appeals, because that's showing, look, there is substantial evidence for the decision. This is not fly-by-night. This is not a quick little decision here. Everybody's been invested and has gone through it. So that is why it can be very important, even if it's very brief. So what are some other quick things just to mention for you to be aware of? Open meetings. Maryland has an open meetings law. I think many of you have, or some of you, I know the chair and I think vice chair, have attended an open meeting class that we also have given. Generally, board meetings, because they're public hearings, are presumed to be open. That means prior to the meeting, there does have to be reasonable notice to the public, and the idea is that for the people to observe. The open meetings law does not require any level of participation at all. It only means open meetings so people can come in and hear it and observe their public officials in action. That's really what the open meetings law says. There are other elements of the law, such as the public hearings law, that certainly do require participation, yes. Now, can an open meeting be closed? Yes, it can be closed, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. It can be closed for legal advice. But as I also had said earlier, that's not mandated. Just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you necessarily should. In many cases, the legal advice that can be given is not going to be harmful or not in need anyway. That having been said, though, there are times when, look, there's some serious discussion to go back and forth. In past years, I know there have been some serious cases here where there have had to be closed meetings where we sit down in a discussion and go through the legalities of, well, how does this law operate? And again, what's the best decision, the best way for us to reach this decision based on what the law provides? So when that does happen, that is why you can certainly do a closed meeting. There are some required processes in doing that when that's necessary. Certainly advance notice is generally required. So if there is a meeting where we have the sense that it's very likely, it won't be listed to say there will be an open meeting because we don't know until you guys vote on it. But there would be some notice that it's certainly a possibility. It has to meet an exception. Well, usually the exception, I'm assuming it would be legal advice, but there are 14 other exceptions that could apply. Probably not, but dealing with personnel issues or some other matters, it certainly could happen. Maybe if you didn't like the legal advice, that could create a personnel issue. And you could have, not that I want to open the door to that either, but nonetheless. But it has to meet an exception, and then there does have to be a motion and then a public vote where each member of the board is actually recorded in terms of their vote. And then there does have to be a statement as to the general purpose. Afterwards, there have to be follow-up minutes and all that. Now, staff would always assist in making sure that those rules are carefully followed. That is a possibility. It is available as needed. We haven't, partly because where there are some issues, because of the staff reporting, you will usually not get proposals in such a raw fashion that those are open questions. That having been said, if it does happen, that's what we're here to try to help with. What else also applies in addition to open meetings? There's the Public Information Act. And the issue there is, what is public information? Just about everything we deal with. That can be the recorded meetings, that can be minutes, documents, evidence, that could be email correspondence between all of you as well. It very well could be. Even if it's not part of the record, it's a different issue. Email correspondence on something that even is not included in the record could be requested, could be part of it. Can include communications, but not only between members, but also with staff. Exceptions would be as dealing a little bit similar to what a closed meeting would be. There has to be some level of confidentiality, such as if it was a personnel record and ongoing ongoing investigation of some sort, or if there was some confidential business record. There are actually about 40 exceptions, some of which are very, very targeted to like transportation, the Maryland transportation records or library records, if largely are subject to some level of non-disclosure. If you register for a gun, a lot of those records are also protected under a very specific exception. So we had mentioned the open meetings law allows people to observe, but it's public hearings law, which, there we are. Caroline follows very well with where we are. That is what ensures the public have a right to comment. So even when, and your chair, I believe, does that very well, because the record does not show the audience, such as if you had a hearing tonight, this wouldn't be unusual, you don't have anybody here. You still say, is there any public comment? And we kind of chuckle a little bit and say, oh, it'd be kind of surprising if somebody stood up, because it doesn't look like some of the greatest speeches, where there are great speeches made, if there are, in the House and the Senate, or certainly in the Senate, or even in the House, are often made with almost nobody there because they're done on C-SPAN. It's still for the public to be aware of, but generally what we're seeing somebody making a speech. Well, the record is, it may be the video record, to the extent it is, it's going to show you all. It's not going to show the audience. So that's the importance, is for the purpose of the record, to make sure we ask, is there any public comment, even if there's nobody there? Because that eliminates a question. That's not to say that if it went on appeal and say, well, I didn't ask for public comment, it would put us in a position of having to prove there was nobody there. Us proving a negative is hard to do. When you say, is there any public comment, and there isn't any, it eliminates the issue. Just a very minor point. In terms of what do we do with witnesses? Any witness presenting factual evidence, including the applicant, should be sworn in. We do very well at that. That can also include those providing public comment. Now, if they refuse to be sworn, that's fine, but that's going to have to be considered as part of your decision then, to the extent whatever is offered is relevant and important. But generally, those providing public comment really should be sworn in as well, because if you're wanting us to consider it as important as what the applicant has said, it should be under some level of oath. But attorneys are generally not sworn in, and the reason for that is they're arguing on behalf of somebody else. Generally, they don't, what facts they are aware of would be what we'd call hearsay, that is, where they weren't actually present and observing everything, so they don't have the personal knowledge. That's the important thing there. So in some, not in this setting, but in other settings where they have made the mistake to swear in attorneys, that can actually lead to a problem, because, well, then you're arguing that the attorney is presenting facts. If they're aware of the facts and presenting facts, they can't be representing anybody. It just leads to messes in getting there. The rules of procedure do apply for public hearings, again, which can require the pre-hearing statements that we certainly have. It's also important to note that if you have contested issues or lots of people lined up and much testimony, the board chair has control. That's why you have a chair. To regulate the hearing processes, to control the timing and the submissions of evidence. Let's say if you have a very hotly contested case, you have people getting a bit out of control. Look, we're going to control this. People are going to be limited to a certain amount of time. Generally, for when we do have testimonies, we limit them to 3 minutes. But it's within discretion. If you have 1 or 2 people, do you have to limit them at all? Maybe, maybe not. Again, the important thing is that the rules be fair, but that's the power of the chair. In terms of the decision itself, the record does close with each decision. So once you make a decision, the record's done. But you have, and we recommend continue doing, formally closing the record before each final vote. I mean, the vote's still going to be part of the record, but that formality makes it very clear for everybody and for the record itself that we're intending to come to a final decision now. It does need a clear motion, a second and a majority vote, very basic requirement. Usually you're going to have a staff recommendation. Where there are changes, it's important that they be clear. And sometimes there'll be some back and forth. We say, okay, we had 8 conditions, you want to add a 9th, let's get down exactly what it is. The motion doesn't have to repeat the entire 5-page staff recommendation. It's simple enough to say, adopting the staff recommendation, and let's say there are 8 conditions where we're adding a 9th. The 8 conditions that are there are adopted, here's the 9th we're adding. That's the clarity that then you would want, stating as follows. Or if it has already been stated, as just stated, again, it's all going to be part of the record. So as long as we know what it is that was voted on and you're aware of what you're voting on, that's the important thing. Yeah, it says here, clearly clarify, I would say clearly state any additional conditions or requirements. That's pretty much what we wanted to run through. I don't think I've talked too fast, hopefully not, but what questions would you have about any of this or anything else that we could touch on? I should have said as we were going through it, take questions as we went, but...
So I have a question. So
Sure.
during a public hearing,
Mhm.
and there's a recommendation to close the record, and it's seconded, can you then reopen the record?
Sure. Yes, the record, you can, now you're saying once you've
So
made a
you
decision
close
to
it,
close.
and then we're talking about a vote, and then all of a sudden, well, somebody thinks of something.
Actually, that's the proper way to do it, because if there's something else brought up, and it's like, well, we need to do that, doing it in a public setting, we'll make a motion, we'll reopen the record and consider that, because then, with other folks that are there, what would be important if you do reopen the record to take in, maybe it's something else that was submitted, another document that somehow wasn't, it would be important for the applicant, or if there's somebody in strong opposition, that they also be aware of it. And in fairness, the applicant should have the opportunity to, if it's something they're not supportive of, when you reopen the record and slip something in at the end and don't allow any further public comment, that's when you can create a problem with substantial evidence, because it's not in a trial setting, but it's that right of cross-examination. They say the best way to get to the truth is to give folks the chance to question something. So you do want to make sure if you do that, depending on what it is, that there is an opportunity for the other side to also be aware of it. But yes, that would be the process if there's something outside. Because if there's something, you close the record, and then there's something else that comes in, if you don't reopen the record, it can't be part of the decision. Simple as that. So, good question.
And then just to be clear then on process, so there's a hearing, there's testimony on a couple of different sides or whatever, if there is or not. Maybe it's just one person and we've questioned.
Sure.
And then we have our discussion, and then we close the record. Correct?
Generally,
then,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's important during the discussion prior to closing the record that we're heard having that discussion and sort of saying, kind of giving some indication that we've considered what the matter was and what
That's
it
going
is
to
that
be that's going to be part of the substantial evidence. Now, Caroline, is there any element of that from a practical point of view?
I was just going to, when everybody was done, pull up, if I can find what I did with it, the handy-dandy findings from section 24-189 of the city code. And this is kind of your guide to what you need to be discussing as it pertains to any particular application. So it's kind of helpful if you don't know why you want to find in favor of or not in favor of something, particularly with special exceptions. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different set of findings that you can fall back on kind of as a guide for any discussion you might have, because you either need to find that it meets these findings or it doesn't. So I will try at our next special exception particularly, I find it useful, I'll print them out so
Mhm.
you guys have that in front of you. It's in every
And those are
resolution.
gonna be included. Yeah, those
It's in
are
every
included.
resolution as well. These are the things that you need to find that the special exception is in accordance with. And it can't be approved if it's not, and it should be approved if it is. So kind of your feelings about whether something works or doesn't work it needs to be in these findings, and that's a kind of a stronger decision in the
Right.
end, as if it meets those findings.
And stated during discussion,
Yeah,
so that when we close and we decide to vote.
then you have a record of it.
And then the vote is not, I approve and here's my reasons why, but I've already stated it during discussion? Or
Right.
should we be saying, I approve and here's my reasons why?
Frank, I'm gonna defer to you on that, because I always, we've tended to have that kind of discussion, I think, after the record closes, but maybe that's.
You're talking about the timing of the closing
Yeah.
of the record?
Of the
Yeah.
discussion.
I'm trying to figure out, like, when are we closing the record? When are we stating
Your
our own?
discussion is not necessarily gonna be evidence. Your discussion is part of it. I guess my point is, whether you close the record just before you start your discussion or after,
Mhm.
it's not gonna make that much of a difference.
Sure.
And the reason for that is, when we're talking about the record, we're talking about outside stuff. And maybe outside even including a staff recommendation, staff findings. There may be facts that staff took pictures of the area or something like that as well. Your discussion is not necessarily gonna be bringing in additional evidence, because that would be a problem, because again, your decision needs to be based on the record, but it's going to be still technically part of the overall transcript that would be sent to the court if need be. It's not quite the same as the evidence supporting it, but it is showing what the basis was for your decision.
Mhm.
So, one way or another, it doesn't necessarily matter. So if you happen to close the record prior, which many times, but it's what I was asking to make sure that I wasn't saying anything
Okay.
out of the way. If you were to close the record prior to the discussion beginning, your discussion is still going to be included in anything, because that's the basis of your decision,
Got it.
and that's laying out.
Okay.
And again, if one of you in the discussion, to get back to the question that Gary had asked a minute ago, brought up, hey, I've got new evidence here, not part of the record. And actually, that can be the value of we've already closed the record. In order to allow that, we'd have to reopen the record. And in doing that, we'd also have to give the applicant an opportunity to let them see whatever it would do, a letter or something like that, and respond or rebut to that in some way.
But we can, once the record's closed, we can have our discussions.
Oh,
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Right.
It's just
and my
at that
point is,
point-
you're not cutting yourself off if you have already
Right.
closed the record, because your discussion becomes
in the
more
record.
part of the decision.
Right.
You just want to make sure that any questions you have for an applicant or anybody else.
That's right.
It
That's
comes
where I was-
before the close of the
I was
record. So
getting
some
to
of it, is going to would have to come before the close of the record.
And generally, I would always recommend, I've been in some boards where I've said, with your decision, the record's gonna be closed, don't bother. But it can be helpful to clarify, but sometimes it's better at the end of the discussion, prior to the motion, to go ahead and close the record to make sure, because in some cases, you will have a dialogue. Some instances not, but in some instances, well, I have a question about this, I've gotta ask the applicant. That means some fact is gonna be presented. If you've already closed the record, can't be considered.
So if one of the things we were talking about earlier is that it's important for us to be able to show on what basis we
Mhm.
voted, is it enough to have a substantive discussion and then all in favor, aye, those opposed? Or should we each go through and say, I'm in favor because?
Well, as part of your substantive discussion, sometimes it can depend on how you operate as a group.
Mhm.
But generally, what we have done is, as the substantive discussion kind of gets started by saying, okay, we'll start with you, Emil, what do you think about this? And offering a couple of opinions, and then there becomes a dialogue. So that becomes part of the discussion, that's what starts it. okay, that sounds good. Ashley, what do you think? So you get to the substantive discussion, but each member has the chance. Now, sometimes a member may say, I agree with what you've said entirely. Sometimes that's all that needs to be said. It depends on what record you're dealing with, what the issues are that you're dealing with. But it's clear that each member was part of it. Sometimes the discussion may go back and forth to the point that it starts with one, you have discussion back and forth, comes down to you, and you're part of the discussion. Then you have Emil starting out again and becoming also involved. That's fine. That's all part of it. But it is helpful to start. Again, sometimes it's a matter of keeping it simple. If the chair simply sits and says, well, so what do we want to do? It actually can be a lot easier if you're the chair to say, okay, we're going to start on this end. Emil, what do you think? Because that's going to force the discussion. And it takes it out of the chair's trying to force a motion or force somebody to take action. There can be the cases, though, having said that, where there's very limited evidence, such as what is it, the applicant that comes in every year wanting to do the carnival.
Right.
And, I mean, does there really
Not
need
much
to
to
be a
say.
long discussion about that? So we're being practical about this. Is there a likelihood of appeal? Probably not. But things could always happen. But as long as the record is clear that everybody's in favor, and I see no reason. And I even think the last time in that there was a little bit of, so what do you think? Yeah, it sounds good. That's enough. That's enough based on this record, but it shows that everybody at least does agree, as opposed to it not even being clear. Because bear in mind, a lot of times they're going to be reading these trying to listen to these recordings maybe 5 years later, because court processes take time. Let's be optimistic and say it's only 3 years later. Some folks that may be listening to them may not have the best recording equipment. They're all trying to figure out, what exactly did they say? Are they truly in favor of it, or who's voting? Again, it just helps with that clarity.
Yeah.
So.
And the why is, that's the thing I'm most
Yeah.
interested in, is that there's be a record of why, how does it relate to the zoning ordinance? And because we've had, I think at least on one occasion, an appeal that that was remanded back to the Board of Appeals for additional, that they wanted the board to elaborate further on how they came to their decision. So it has happened, so.
And that's been an instance
I
that
don't want that to
happened here in past
Yeah.
years. Good example. Good example.
Frank, you've watched us operate for a couple of years or so now. How long have you?
Yeah, Caroline was saying it's been 4 or 5 years. I'm
Yeah.
not sure I'm that old.
It's been longer than I
But,
thought.
but yeah, it's
What do we-
been about that time. And
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we most often not remember? What do we, coming out of this, as you've kind of refreshed us on the things procedurally we need to be aware of? What are the things that we forget or we don't do right each time, or, any recommendations
generally,
for
if
us
there's
going forward?
something that is a concern, a lot of times what will happen is, in a quick decision, it's not going to be an issue. But one of the rules is that at the times when you want to have certain processes you're careful to follow. And you follow them even in the decisions where you don't think it matters, because the processes you follow in the easy ones are going to be the ones you follow when it matters.
Right.
So if you take an easy approach and don't do something, just usually it's not going to be intentional at all, but just moving quickly through and, let's get out of here type of thing. If that were to happen, that same process could happen in a more serious case that, we could be looking at the possibility of appeal, and you don't want to face an appeal or face a remand based on some technical reason. So when that happens, I'll generally say something. The current chair has always been very, very, and most everybody I work with say, hey, here's an idea for, you may want to make sure to do this. That's been very few. You generally do a very good job overall. When the chair says, what do you think? You've got something to say, and it's pretty clear. So, but I will say, if my dad used to say, if I had a problem with you, you would know. And he meant things many different, of a different level than what I'm saying. God rest his soul. But But if
Good.
there is a concern, we'll let you know. The other thing is, Caroline, I mean, you look to me, Caroline also is very aware of what works and could probably have given this presentation as well, to be honest with you. But she too, and sometimes that's a matter of, hey, what's the issue here? Or Greg, or Jasmine as well. So again, that's the power of staff, and that's our job, is to let you know. So we will let you know. You generally do a great job, and even on the simple cases that are quite quick, you still go through the right process. And that's, as I said, that's what matters, because you have a sense that, okay, if we get one that is more of an issue, and we've had a few of those recently too.
Every couple of years,
It
something.
becomes, well, but it can always happen. That becomes the habit. And it's better to, okay, let's make sure we cover something. Now, I've had other boards where sometimes I've had to remind them, hey, you need to ask for public comment. And I've had in just past years say, well, there isn't any public here. I want the record to make it clear that you asked. So, now, would I say that in the midst of the hearing? If I say, hey, you need to ask for public comment, they come back and say, well, there isn't anybody here. If my purpose is to get that on the record, I just got it on the record.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
fine. But
Yeah.
afterwards, I may say, it really is important that you do that. So, I'm not there to derail anything, but generally, as I say, you're doing very well, and the alternate, you certainly do have a good board to learn from in terms of the meetings that we have. So, again, welcome. Yes, sir.
And it's happened in the past, but when would it get to the point where we would have to excuse ourselves and ask for help from, staff or council in like a closed session? Where do we know when we need to get to that point where we're like scratching our heads and, we need help?
Well, I would say
How deep does it need
it's
to go?
not you all necessarily to have the burden on that. I mean, I would say if you have a question, if you have a legal question, ask. And if it's not a simple answer that doesn't take a lot of analysis, that isn't something that is, because it can be beyond something that's helpful even for the applicant or those opposing to be aware of, that also falls to some extent to us to realize that, we're getting to the point. But, certainly if it does cross your comfort level to say, look, I would rather just have a very honest back and forth, and I need more than just two answers to a question here. There needs to be more of a dialogue. That can be appropriate to say, look, more is needed here. Generally the law does require advance notice, so doing it sua sponte can be tough. So I would say if it looks like there is that possibility, that's not to say it's impossible. If a closed meeting needs to happen because of something that happens during the hearing and we really do need to have a discussion about it, the awkward thing of doing it in the midst of a hearing is you either have to throw the folks out or we have to go upstairs and have the discussion. That's been done.
We used to do it
That has been
often.
done, so that can be
Yes.
done. So I'm not saying it can't. The better way is if we know in advance, we have it on there, and if it comes to that time, either at the beginning of the meeting or the end of the meeting, because that way you're not necessarily disrupting the midst of the meeting. But
It's when a
no, I would say
curveball
it's not
gets,
on you to
thrown at you.
I mean, you can, but if there's a concern about, well, is this an easy answer or not, ask. And if it comes down to the point, because sometimes it'll be staff to say, it may be more appropriate to get into the level of that detail that we have a closed session and go back and forth. And that would, in some ways, either fall to me or maybe even Caroline to say, this is not going to be just a quick response.
So the one thing to keep in mind when we do have closed sessions is that it's very important that that the board not do any deliberating in the closed session. You're there to collect legal advice, but not have any discussion about that should be had on the record in front of the public. So there's always that fine line between, you know, you need to ask something, it's going to raise some discussion, most likely, but you can't really have the discussion about whatever you find out the legal advice is until you come back on the record.
It would be unusual, I mean, I know it's happened, but it's not typical even in the history of the board, and it would be an unusual situation for, in most cases, for me to say based on what you're looking at, because you're applying basic facts that are being presented to you to the law, but certainly if it does happen, those processes are available for us to do it. But generally, you know, I think we can answer the questions and work through the law. And in most cases, the advice you would be getting, it's in some ways helpful for the applicant to see, okay, I hear the same thing. That way they're aware of what's happening. And even for the public to also, to the extent they may be observing whether here or on TV, for them to be aware as well and say, oh, okay. Because in some ways that shows this is why we're doing this. This is the legal advice that we're given.
So I just wanted to go back to the question of the board discussion, and I guess to reiterate that when there's a special exception in front of us, that we may say, hey, that we have this exception in front of us, and I'm just reading from here, and you know, I see that it will not be detrimental to the use, peaceful enjoyment, economic value, or development of surrounding properties or general neighborhood, that can be part of our discussion.
Sure.
As part of our board discussion after we've closed the record, and that we can still have that discussion.
Because what you're going to be discussing is what's already in the record.
Exactly.
But your discussion will be part of the decision that goes forward. I mean, it may not, your decision isn't going to be a transcript. Your decision is going to be the resolution that's laid out. As you decide that resolution, change the staff recommendation or whatever. But your discussion is part of that in terms of the basis for that that decision.
Yes.
And what you're discussing back and forth will be that other item, which will be the actual record of the case, which is the factual record.
Okay.
So
that's very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you, Frank.
No, that good to ask that so that it's clear. So glad to do that. The one other thing I would add, and I think we had the discussion at the Planning Commission, because sometimes you have members who aren't there for a meeting, and there is a burgeoning sense that if you are not present for a meeting, you have no choice but you have to recuse from the approval of the minutes. Robert's Rules of Order actually doesn't say that at all, and other municipal or local process rules, which can be different states that have Maryland has a Maryland Municipal League. Other states, Arkansas, California, also have municipal leagues and county leagues and all of that. None of them recommend that either. The reason is that when you're voting to approve the minutes, you don't necessarily have to have personal knowledge that you were at the meeting. All you're voting on is the minutes should consist of action items taken. So the minutes for your meeting would be perhaps tonight that you got this report, but normally it would be that you made a decision on a particular case. You don't have to be there because your vote to approve it is simply to say that you're satisfied that the documentation, the minutes that are there, accurately reflect the actions that were taken, and you're satisfied. It's understandable that the person maybe moving and seconding the approval was actually present. That's understandable. But there's really not a need to recuse if you weren't there. And as I say, I was somewhat surprised, but the question came up a few years ago because sometimes with planning, depending on the mix of members and if you have a change of membership, it's like, well, can we even get them approved? Right. Yes, as long as you have members there, they don't have to have been present. What they're basically saying is we trust that the system worked and then the minutes are okay. Just an FYI.
Cool.
So, Ashley, do you have any questions?
No, this was incredibly informative, but we Also just spent in October, I was at the Planning Commissioner Conference that we had in Gaithersburg, which was lovely, by the way. It was very interesting. So some of this was, again, a review, but as always, Frank, you made it interesting, so I appreciate that. And we do have really good staff that support us, and I think that bears a mention as well. I honestly don't know what we would do without our staff, because we always are so prepared for these meetings, so it's very beneficial for us in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emil, any questions?
No, this was very helpful. Thank you for the overview, Frank. So that it helps to put it into the overall context. And I look forward to seeing the board in action to see this practically implemented and learning from your experience. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you.
Thank you. Is there any further questions from anyone else on the board? Any additional comments, Frank?
No, I would say thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it's not that far before we get into the holidays, and really the holiday season has already started. So to have everybody here and listen to the presentation is certainly very helpful, because it is helpful to have a chance actually to get some of the information, and when there's a question burgeoning, to ask. But I would say during a hearing, or perhaps even at the end of, let's say, end of a hearing, we're doing staff comments. If there is a question, that's why I'm here. Go ahead and ask, and we'll do the best we can to give you whatever advice we can.
Okay, well,
So,
thank you. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
And so, thank you for this excellent presentation, and I know we've welcomed you a few times, Emil, but from the board ourselves here as the chair and the rest of the members, we welcome you as our newest alternate. So, thank you for joining our team. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so it's from the staff now. The next item.
No,
Carolyn?
I have, I think, I can't remember if I sent you electronic copies of the 2019 calendar, but they will, if they're not already on the website, they will be, but I printed out copies for
That
everyone.
would be great.
Just so you have one.
Glad to take a copy.
It looks like the application deadline for January was actually yesterday. We were maybe going to have one, but looks like that's going to be pushed till February. So unless an administrative appeal comes in, I anticipate we will not have a January meeting. But we should have a February meeting.
And it won't be on the 14th.
And it won't be on the 14th.
Oh, that's right.
Yes.
I love that.
Every few years, we have a Valentine's Day board meeting, but not this year. So I hope everybody has a happy holiday and a happy new year.
Oh my gosh.
We'll not see you all until 2019.
Okay, well, thank you. Anything else? All right, well, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn, but I need that, what's the,
That's all you say.
Oh.
Just make a motion to adjourn.
oh, I make a motion to adjourn.
So moved. This meeting is now over.
You were looking at me.
Thank you.